Welcome back, guys. Today we are going to follow one man on the slowest journey home ever recorded, and we are going to take our time doing it, because you have nowhere to be tonight except to sleep. Here are the numbers first, because the numbers are what make the story so strange. The distance from the ruins of Troy to the little island of Ithaca is roughly 560 miles of open water. A Bronze Age ship with a fair wind and a competent crew could cover that in 2 weeks. 3 if the weather turned mean, 4 if everything went wrong. The man we are following tonight took 10 years. In those 10 years he was trapped in a cave by a one-eyed giant who ate his friends in front of him. He was offered eternal life by a goddess and turned it down. He sailed past the edge of the known world and into the country of the dead, where he spoke with his own mother and had to hold a sword between them. He lost 12 ships and 600 men, every single one of them, until there was nobody left to lose. And when he finally reached his own front door, he found 108 strangers sitting in his hall, eating his cattle, drinking his wine, and waiting for his wife to give up on him. Before we push off from shore, take just a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy these long, quiet retellings. It costs you nothing, it takes 2 seconds, and it keeps these stories coming. And do one more thing for me if you would. Leave your location and your local time down in the comments. There is something strangely comforting about scrolling through those and seeing a name from Manila at 3 in the morning, and one from Dublin just after midnight, and one from a night shift somewhere in Ohio. It helps other sleepless people find their way here. It reminds all of us that being awake at this hour is not a lonely condition. It is a very crowded one. Now settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the weight of the day go out of your hands. You are about to drift into the story of Odysseus, king of Ithaca, the man the ancient world called the most cunning of all the Greeks, and also, when it was in a less generous mood, the biggest liar in the Mediterranean. Our story does not begin with the hero. It begins with the hole where he used to be. Picture a small rocky island off the western coast of Greece, somewhere around the year 1200 before the Common Era. The island is called Ithaca. It is not a wealthy place, and nobody has ever pretended otherwise. The soil is thin and full of stones. The hills are steep and better suited to goats than to grain. What Ithaca has instead of farmland is water. Deep harbours, sheltered bays, and a position that puts it squarely on the sea roads. It is a place that breeds sailors because it cannot afford to breed farmers. On the highest ground of the island stands a palace, though you should adjust the picture in your head. Not marble columns, not golden gates. Think instead of a large, sprawling house of cut stone and heavy timber built up over generations. Storerooms lined with great clay jars of wine and olive oil. A wide central hall with a round hearth burning in the middle of it, and a hole in the roof for the smoke. A dusty courtyard where the hunting dogs sleep in whatever patch of sun they can find. Wealth in that world was not counted in coins, because coins had not been invented yet. It was counted in bronze cauldrons, in fine woven cloth, in stored oil, and in animals on the hillside. This house belongs to a king named Odysseus, and Odysseus has not been seen in 20 years. He left when his son was still a newborn, sailing east with 12 ships and roughly 600 men to fight in a war at a city called Troy. Everyone in the Greek world knows how that war ended. It lasted 10 years, it consumed a generation, and it ended in a Greek victory. And then, one by one, the kings came home. Nestor sailed safely back to sandy Pylos, and grew comfortably old telling war stories to anyone who could not escape the room. Menelaus eventually reached Sparta with Helen at his side, the same Helen whose face had started the whole catastrophe in the first place. Even Agamemnon, the high king of all the Greeks, made it back to his own harbour, though what waited for him when he walked through his own front door is a grim story we will get to later tonight. And it matters more than it looks. But of Odysseus, nothing, no ship. No message, no wreckage, no body washed up on any beach that anyone could name. For 10 years after the war ended, the sea simply refused either to give him back or to admit that it had kept him. And this is where the trouble grows, quietly, the way rot grows in a beam. In the Bronze Age Greek world, a kingdom without a king is a wound that will not close on its own. There was no clear law of succession waiting in a drawer, no council of regents, no orderly civil service to keep the lights on until the situation resolved itself. There was property, and there were strong men who wanted the property, and there was nothing much in between. By the time our story opens, 108 of those strong men have moved into the palace of Odysseus. They are the young nobles of Ithaca and the neighbouring islands, the sons of the local aristocracy, and they are called the suitors, because officially every last one of them is there to marry the queen. Her name is Penelope. Whoever marries her takes the house, the herds, the storerooms, and in all likelihood the throne. It is the biggest prize available in that corner of the world, and it is sitting there apparently unclaimed. So they wait, and while they wait, they eat. Day after day, month after month, year after year, the suitors slaughter the king's cattle and his pigs, drain his wine cellars, lounge in his great hall throwing dice, and shout at the servants for more. They have been doing this for years now. It is a slow, smiling, entirely legal form of robbery. No single feast breaks any rule. But 1,000 feasts stacked one on top of another are bleeding the estate white. And there is something worse underneath it, something an ancient audience would have felt in their stomachs. The Greeks had a sacred custom called xenia, guest friendship, the law of hospitality. It obliged a household to feed and shelter a stranger who came to the door, no questions asked, before you even learned his name. It obliged the guest, in turn, to behave, to accept what was offered, and to leave. It was not politeness. It was the closest thing that world had to international law, and Zeus himself was believed to enforce it personally. The suitors have taken that beautiful custom and turned it into a weapon. They are guests who will not leave. They are using the law that protects strangers to devour a household from the inside. At the centre of that occupied house, 2 people are holding the line. The first is Penelope. She is one of the most quietly remarkable characters in all of ancient literature, and she is remarkable precisely because she has no weapons at all. She cannot fight the suitors. She cannot expel them. She has no army, no brother in arms, no husband, and no proof that her husband is even alive. What she has is patience and a very fine mind, and for 20 years those are the only 2 things standing between her family and complete ruin. Her most famous trick bought her 3 of those years. She announced to the suitors that she would choose a new husband as soon as she had finished weaving a burial shroud for her elderly father-in-law, Laertes. This was unanswerable. It was pious, it was proper, it was a daughter-in-law's sacred duty, and no man in that hall could object to it without looking like a monster in front of his rivals. So every day she sat at her great upright loom and wove, and every night, by torchlight with the house asleep, she quietly unpicked the day's work thread by thread by thread. The shroud never grew. The wedding never came any closer. 3 years of that. 3 years of unmaking her own work in the dark, and it took a disloyal servant girl to finally betray her and tell the suitors why the cloth was immortal. The second person holding the line is Telemachus, the son. He was an infant in his mother's arms when his father sailed. He is now a young man of about 20, which means he has never once, not for a single moment he can remember, seen his father's face. He has grown up in a house full of louder, older, better-armed men who mock him at his own table. He has grown up in the shadow of a legend he has no memory of. He is exactly old enough to be furious about all of it, and not nearly strong enough to do anything. There are 108 of them. There is one of him. That is the situation on Ithaca as our story opens, and it is worth pausing on something, because it tells you what kind of story this actually is. The poem that carries this tale, the Odyssey, does not open with its hero. It does not open with monsters or storms or gods. It opens with the mess he left behind. A household on the edge of collapse. A woman running out of tricks. A boy running out of time. The audience hearing this poem sung aloud at a feast 3,000 years ago understood the stakes immediately. This is not simply an adventure story about giants and witches, though it certainly is that as well. It is a story about whether order, once broken, can ever be put back. It is a story about what a home is worth and what a man will spend to get back to one. Now, a word about where this story comes from, because the survival of it is nearly as astonishing as the tale itself. The Odyssey is attributed to a poet we call Homer, and it was composed somewhere around the 8th century before the Common Era. That is roughly 700 years before Julius Caesar and about 2,700 years before you and me. But here is the strange part. The world it describes is not Homer's world. The Trojan War and its aftermath belong to the Greek Bronze Age, some 400 or 500 years before Homer was born. That civilization had already collapsed by his time. Its palaces had burned. Its writing system had been lost so completely that nobody could read it anymore. Its kings had faded into legend. Homer was singing about a vanished golden age, the way we might tell stories about knights and castles and round tables, half history and half dream. And for a long time the poem was not written down at all. It lived inside the memories of professional singers, men who could hold tens of thousands of lines in their heads and perform them from memory, adjusting, polishing, and improving night after night in front of live audiences who knew the story and would notice if you got it wrong. The Odyssey runs to about 12,000 lines. Sung aloud at a natural pace, it takes somewhere in the region of 20 hours to perform, which means the original audience experienced it more or less exactly the way you are experiencing it tonight. In the dark. Over many evenings, told by a single voice while they lay down and let their eyes close. Nobody knows who Homer really was. Nobody knows whether he was one man or a whole tradition of men wearing the same name. There was a persistent ancient tradition that he was blind. The Greeks themselves argued about all of it, and 7 different cities claimed to be his birthplace, which mostly tells you that being the hometown of Homer was excellent for the local economy even 25 centuries ago. What matters for us tonight is the story, and the story is missing a man. So let us find him. Far from Ithaca, at the very hour those suitors are carving up another of his oxen, Odysseus is sitting on a beach at the edge of the world, on an island that appears on no map, weeping at the water and looking east toward a home he has not seen in 20 years. To understand how he got there, we have to go back. Back before the giants, before the storms, before the wooden horse. Back to a wedding in Sparta and a very clever young man with no money, who solved everyone's problem and accidentally built the trap that would swallow his own life. To understand why Odysseus ever left that rocky island, we have to go back about a decade before the war, to a wedding problem in the city of Sparta. The king of Sparta at that time was a man named Tyndareus, and he had a daughter named Helen, who was said, by everyone who saw her, and by a great many who had not, to be the most beautiful woman in the world. On the surface this sounds like a blessing for a father. In practice it was closer to a national security crisis. Every unmarried king, prince and ambitious nobleman in the Greek world wanted to marry her. Dozens of them arrived in Sparta at the same time, and they did not arrive quietly. They came with retinues, with gifts, with armed men, and with the particular touchiness of young aristocrats who have been told since birth that their honour is the most important thing about them. Whichever suitor Tyndareus chose, the rest would be publicly humiliated in front of the entire Greek world. And humiliation of that kind had a way of turning into raiding parties within the year. The wedding of the century was one wrong word away from becoming a battlefield, and the father of the bride knew it. He simply could not announce a decision. Every day he delayed, more armed men arrived. Every day he delayed, the pressure in the room rose a little higher. Somewhere in that crowd of suitors stood a young king from the Western Islands. He was not especially rich. His kingdom was small and stony. He was not, by the standards of that gathering, particularly impressive to look at, and he was standing among men whose households could have bought his entire island. But he was already known for something else, and word of it had travelled ahead of him. He was known for his brain. This was Odysseus. And Odysseus, standing at the edge of that overcrowded hall and reading the situation the way other men read weather, worked out two things very quickly. The first was that he had no realistic chance of winning Helen. The competition included men from the wealthiest houses in Greece, and this was a contest that would be settled largely by the size of the gift a suitor could place at Tyndareus's feet. He was simply outspent, and he was clear-eyed enough to see it without sulking about it. The second was that there was still an opportunity here, and it was a better one. So he went quietly to Tyndareus in private and offered him a way out of the entire dangerous mess. In exchange, he asked for a favour. The solution was simple, and it was the kind of simple that only occurs to a very particular kind of mind. Before any decision was announced, before any name was spoken, every single suitor in that hall would swear a solemn oath. Binding, sworn before the gods, over a sacrifice, in front of witnesses. Each man would swear that he would accept whatever choice was made without complaint. And then the second half of the oath, which is the half that mattered, and the half that history turned on. Each man further swore that if anyone ever violated that marriage, he would come to its defence. By force, wherever it happened, however long it took. Every suitor swore, and every suitor swore gladly, because every suitor in that room believed he was about to be the winner, and a promise of universal armed backing sounded magnificent when you assumed you were the one being backed. Then Tyndareus made his choice. He named Menelaus, a prince of the powerful house of Atreus and the brother of Agamemnon. And nobody objected. Nobody could object. Every man in the hall had just publicly bound himself before the gods not to. The crisis dissolved. The armed men went home. Sparta survived its own wedding, and the favour Odysseus had asked for in return tells you exactly what he actually valued in life, and it was not Helen. He asked Tyndareus to help him win the hand of a different woman entirely, the king's niece, a young woman named Penelope, clever, level-headed, patient, and by every account we have, a far better match for him than the most beautiful woman in the world would ever have been. He got her. And by all the evidence the tradition gives us, it turned into that rarest thing in all of Greek mythology, which is a genuinely happy marriage between two people who actually liked each other. He took his bride home across the water to Ithaca, and in time they had a son. Now notice what this young man had just accomplished in the space of a few days. He had diffused a war that had not started yet. He had put the most powerful family in Greece permanently in his debt. And he had walked away with the wife he actually wanted, at a cost of nothing but an idea. He had also, without any way of knowing it, built the trap that would one day close on his own life. That oath he invented was a loaded weapon left lying on the table of Greek politics. It sat there for years, harmless, admired, occasionally mentioned at feasts as a clever piece of statecraft. It only needed someone to pick it up. The someone was a prince of Troy, named Paris. Now Troy was a real place. This is worth saying plainly, because it changes how the whole story sits in your mind. Its ruins stand today on a low hill in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik, overlooking the narrow strait that connects the Aegean to the Black Sea. In the late Bronze Age it was a wealthy, heavily fortified city, perfectly positioned to take a cut of every cargo that passed between two seas. It had massive sloping stone walls that archaeologists have physically dug out of the earth and stood next to and photographed. To the Greeks it was rich, sophisticated, slightly foreign, and enormously tempting. According to the legend, the trouble started at a wedding on Mount Olympus, when the goddess of discord, who had not been invited and was extremely aware of it, tossed a golden apple into the middle of the party. Written on the apple were the words for the fairest. 3 goddesses immediately claimed it: Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom and warcraft; and Aphrodite, goddess of love. The argument escalated until it reached Zeus, who was asked to judge which of the three was most beautiful. And Zeus, displaying the survival instinct that had kept him on the throne for so long, refused to touch it. He handed the decision to a mortal, specifically to a handsome young Trojan prince, who was at that moment minding cattle on a mountainside and expecting nothing more dramatic from his afternoon than the cattle. Each goddess offered Paris a bribe, because this was not a beauty contest for very long. Hera offered him power, dominion over all of Asia. Athena offered him wisdom and victory in every battle he ever fought. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, being young, chose the woman. It is generally considered the worst decision in the whole of Greek mythology, and it achieved that title against genuinely fierce competition. The most beautiful woman in the world was of course already married. This did not slow Aphrodite down in the slightest. When Paris later came to Sparta on a diplomatic visit, Menelaus received him with full honours, feasted him for days, treated him with every courtesy the sacred law of hospitality demanded, and then trustingly sailed off to a funeral in Crete, leaving his guest at home with his wife. When Menelaus came back, Helen was gone, sailed away to Troy with Paris, and a considerable portion of the palace treasury had gone with her. Whether she went willingly or was carried off by force is a question the Greeks themselves argued about for over 1,000 years, and the ancient sources will happily give you both versions depending on which author you pick up. Homer himself is careful and ambiguous about it in a way that has kept scholars busy ever since. Either way, the oath came due. Menelaus went to his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and the most powerful ruler in Greece, and Agamemnon sent out the call. Every man who had sworn that oath in Sparta all those years ago was now legally, religiously, and publicly bound to sail against Troy and bring Helen back. The weapon on the table had been picked up, and the man who had made it was on the list. Here we come to one of the most human moments in the entire legend, and one of my favourites, because it is the moment the great hero of the story tries as hard as he possibly can not to be in it. Odysseus did not want to go. He was not a coward. Nothing in his life before or after suggests anything of the kind. But he could count, and he had a very good head for consequences. Troy was far away. Its walls were famous throughout the world. The city was rich enough to hire allies and fortified enough to outlast a siege, which meant this war was not going to be a summer's raiding trip. It was going to be long. And he had, at that moment, a young wife he loved, an infant son he had barely met, and a small kingdom that would come apart without him. There was also a prophecy, an old warning delivered years before, that if he went to Troy he would not return for 20 years, and that when he did come home he would come alone, with nothing, and be recognised by no one. So when the recruiters landed on Ithaca, led by a sharp-eyed noble named Palamedes, Odysseus tried the only escape available to a man bound by a sacred oath sworn before the gods. He could not refuse, he could not break the oath, but an oath sworn by a sane man does not bind a madman. So he went mad. The recruiters came up from the harbour and found the king of Ithaca out in a field ploughing, and ploughing it wrong in every way it is possible to plough a field wrong. He had yoked an ox and a donkey together, two animals of completely different sizes, strengths and walking speeds, so that the plough lurched and staggered and wandered off its line. He was sowing the furrows with salt instead of seed, scattering it by the handful, salting the very ground he was supposedly planting. And when the visitors called out to him, he looked straight through them as though they were made of air and kept walking his crooked, ruinous line. It was a good performance. It was honestly an excellent performance. A madman cannot swear an oath, and a madman certainly cannot command ships. Palamedes did not believe a word of it, and Palamedes, being nearly as clever as the man he had come to collect, and considerably more ruthless about it, devised a test that was as simple as it was appalling. He walked to the house, took the infant Telemachus out of his nurse's arms, carried the baby out into the field, and laid him down on the ground directly in the path of the oncoming plough. Then He stood back and watched. Odysseus swerved. Of course he swerved. He swerved instantly, and in that one movement the entire performance collapsed. A man sane enough to save his son was sane enough to sail to Troy. So Odysseus went to war. He never forgave Palamedes for it, and years later, on the plain outside Troy, he took a cold and carefully engineered revenge, forging evidence that framed the man as a traitor taking Trojan gold and letting the army stone him to death for it. It is one of the darkest stories attached to his name, and the Odyssey itself politely never mentions it once. But it is worth knowing tonight, because it shows you the other edge of the blade. The same cleverness that will save this man again and again in the story we are about to follow could also be turned to destroy, and it was. Once he was caught, Odysseus did something that tells you a great deal about how his mind worked. He stopped resisting entirely and threw himself into the war with the energy of a man who has calculated that the shortest road home now runs directly through the middle of it. If the war had to happen, then the war had to be won, and won fast. And so the reluctant king became the expedition's chief recruiter, negotiator, and fixer, the man Agamemnon sent whenever something needed to be arranged rather than smashed. His most famous catch was a teenager hidden on the island of Skyros. The boy's mother was a goddess, and she had been told that her son was fated to die at Troy if he ever went there. So she had done what any mother with divine connections and no scruples would do. She had smuggled him to a remote island court, dressed him in girls' clothing, and hidden him among the daughters of the local king, where no recruiter would ever think to look. The boy's name was Achilles, and the prophecies said he would be the greatest warrior of his generation. The Greeks had also been told, in the maddening way these things always work, that Troy could not be taken without him. Odysseus found him with a trick, because of course he did. He arrived on the island disguised as a travelling peddler, and laid out his wares in front of the king's daughters. Fine cloth, jewellery, ribbons, mirrors, the whole glittering inventory. And mixed in among the trinkets, lying there as though by accident, a spear and a shield. Then, while the girls were browsing, he had arranged for a war trumpet to sound the alarm outside, and men to shout that the island was under attack. The girls scattered, screaming, exactly as girls in that situation would. One of them grabbed the spear and the shield and turned to face the door. Odysseus had his man. By the time the fleet finally assembled at the port of Aulis, it was the largest armed force the Greek world had ever put together. More than 1,000 ships, according to the poets, drawn from every kingdom in Greece, and behind them the entire military strength of a civilization. Odysseus commanded 12 ships from Ithaca and the Western Islands. It was a modest squadron next to the 100 ships Agamemnon had brought from Mycenae alone, and everyone knew it. But the High King had not insisted on his presence because of the numbers. He had insisted because of what was inside the man's head. And then, before a single oar touched Trojan water, the expedition ran into the first sign of what it was actually going to cost. The wind failed, not for a day, not for a week. The fleet sat trapped in the harbour at Aulis, while the sails hung dead, and 1,000 ships full of impatient armed men began to rot in place, eating through their supplies, quarrelling, getting sick. A priest was consulted, and the priest returned with an answer nobody wanted. Agamemnon had somehow given offence to the goddess Artemis, and Artemis wanted payment. The payment she named was the life of his own daughter, Iphigenia. The girl was sent for under a lie. She was told she was coming to Aulis to be married to Achilles, the greatest young hero in the army, a wedding any princess would have hurried toward. She arrived dressed for it, and her father, the High King of all the Greeks, had her killed on an altar in front of the assembled fleet so that the weather would change. The wind rose, the ships sailed. And back in Mycenae, a queen named Clytemnestra began a long, silent, patient hatred of her husband that would eventually finish what 10 years of Trojan spears could not manage. I want you to hold on to that moment, because the poem does. Everything that happens over the next 20 years happens inside a world where that is possible. where a father can do that, and the fleet can sail anyway. And nobody stops it. The 1,000 ships crossed the Aegean toward a war that every man aboard expected to be short and profitable. It consumed 10 years and the best men of an entire generation. And through all of it, holding the fraying enterprise together with words and tricks and sheer stubbornness, was the man who had salted a field trying not to come. 10 years in front of those walls. The Greeks beached their ships on the shore below the city, built a fortified camp with a ditch and a palisade, and settled in for what they still believed would be a quick campaign. To understand why it was not, you only have to look at what they were facing. The walls of Troy were the finest fortifications anywhere in that part of the world. High courses of cut stone, sloped outward at the base so that ladders sat badly and battering was useless, crowned with brick, anchored by towers, and so famous throughout the Mediterranean that the legends claimed gods had helped build them. And the Greeks of the Bronze Age had nothing to answer that with. No siege towers, no catapults, no engineering tradition for cracking a fortress of that scale, because nobody had ever needed one. What they had was infantry, chariots, and time. So the war became something slower and stranger than the sieges we picture. The Greeks could not seal the city off completely, which meant supplies and reinforcements kept trickling in from Troy's allies across Anatolia. The Trojans, for their part, could not push the invaders back into the sea. For years the fighting rolled back and forth across the plain between the walls and the ships, while Greek raiding squadrons ranged up and down the coast sacking smaller towns for food, treasure and captives, because an army of that size has to eat, and there was no supply line home. In that long grind, different men mattered in different ways, and it is worth naming them, because you will meet several of them again tonight in a much darker place. Achilles was the spearhead, the terror of the battlefield, a man genuinely worth a regiment by himself, whose arrival on any part of the line changed what was possible there. Great Ajax was the wall, an enormous man behind an enormous tower shield who simply did not break and did not retreat, and who was the person you sent for when a position absolutely had to hold. Agamemnon held overall command, with all the friction that implies. Old Nestor of Pylos supplied experience, advice, and very long stories. And Odysseus became something the army had no other supply of. He became its mind. When the Greeks needed a negotiator, they sent him. Before the fighting even started, he and Menelaus walked into Troy itself, under diplomatic protection, and stood up in front of the Trojan assembly to demand Helen's return and avoid the entire war. The Trojans who were in that room remembered it for the rest of their lives, and the poem lets one of them describe it years later. He did not look like much when he stood up, they said. He stood there stiffly, eyes on the ground, holding the speaker's staff without moving it, so awkward and sullen that you might have taken him for a fool or a resentful man with nothing to say. And then he began to speak, and the words came down like snow in a winter storm, and no living man could stand against him. Troy refused the demand anyway. And this is one of the quietly tragic hinges of the whole legend, because there were Trojans in that assembly who wanted to hand Helen back and be done with the danger. The city was not united, but the court around old King Priam chose war, and the road forked, and everyone who died over the next 10 years died on the other branch. When the army's morale finally cracked, it was Odysseus who repaired it. This happened in the 9th year, and it happened because of a spectacularly bad management decision. Agamemnon, wanting to test the mood of his exhausted troops, stood up in assembly and suggested they give the whole thing up and sail home. He fully expected them to shout him down and demand to stay. It was meant to be a piece of theatre that would end with a roar of defiance. Instead, they cheered. And then they ran for the ships. 9 years of siege, 1,000 ships, an entire generation of Greek manhood, and the whole enterprise came within about 10 minutes of dissolving on the beach into a stampede. It was Odysseus who stopped it. He grabbed the royal staff, went through the mob, shamed the officers by name, physically struck the loudest agitator in front of everyone, and drove the army back to its assembly place. Then he talked them back into their own war. No sword accomplished more that day than that man's voice did, and the poem knows it. When quarrels broke out at the top, he was the one they sent to fix them, and the most dangerous quarrel came late. Agamemnon publicly humiliated Achilles over a captive woman, taking her from him as a display of authority, and Achilles, the one man the army could not replace, withdrew himself and all his troops from the fighting, and sat in his tent by the sea while the war went wrong without him. Trojan attacks pushed all the way to the beach. Greek ships began to burn. Agamemnon, humbled at last, assembled an enormous offer of gifts to bring him back, and chose Odysseus to lead the embassy and make the case. Because if anyone could talk that man out of his tent, it was him. Odysseus laid out the offer with every persuasive skill he had, and he had all of them, and Achilles refused him flat. It is one of the very few recorded defeats of Odysseus in the art of speech, and it stands out precisely because it is so rare. In the end, it took the death of Achilles' dearest friend Patroclus to do what no argument could. And when the work was dirty, he did that too. One black night, he and the warrior Diomedes slipped out of the camp to scout the Trojan lines, and caught a Trojan spy named Dolon creeping the other way on the same errand. They promised him his life in exchange for information. He gave them everything he knew, every position, every password, and then they killed him anyway. Then they used what he had told them to find the camp of a newly arrived Trojan ally, a Thracian king, and they cut his throat and the throats of 12 of his men while they slept, and drove off his famous horses before dawn. On another occasion, Odysseus had himself whipped and bloodied and disguised as a beaten runaway slave, and walked into Troy itself to gather intelligence inside the walls. Helen recognized him there, and by then she was so weary of the city and everything her life had become that she kept his secret. Later still, he and Diomedes went back into Troy one final time to steal the Palladium, the sacred image of Athena on which, prophecy said, the safety of the city depended. You will have noticed that these are not glorious deeds in the way Achilles was glorious. Night raids, disguises, interrogations, assassinations, theft of holy objects. Homeric warfare had a code, and Odysseus spent the entire war operating along its edges, doing the things that had to be done and that nobody wanted their name attached to. The Greeks themselves felt this tension keenly. Later centuries argued about him endlessly, some celebrating the resourceful survivor, others condemning the liar and the schemer who murdered a sleeping man. He is the rare legendary figure who ended up being simultaneously the most admired and the most distrusted man in his own story. And the war ground on, and it began taking the great names, one after another, until only the difficult one was left standing. Hector went first among the great ones. The noble defender of Troy, the eldest son of Priam, the one man on that side of the wall who might have held the city together for another generation, went out to face Achilles alone beneath the walls with his family watching from the towers, and died there in the dust. And Achilles, half mad with grief for Patroclus, did not stop at killing him. He tied the body behind his chariot and dragged it in circles around the walls, in full view of the man's parents and wife and infant son, and went on doing it for days. It took the old king himself to end it. Priam crossed the plain alone at night, an old man with no escort, walked into the camp of the enemy, and knelt down in the tent of the man who had killed his son, and took that man's hands in his own, and kissed them, and asked for the body of his boy. And Achilles, who had been unmovable by armies and unbribable by kings, looked at this old man on his knees and thought of his own father far away in Greece, and broke. He gave the body back. He ordered a truce for the funeral rites, 11 days of peace, so that Troy could bury its defender properly. That truce, that quiet, exhausted moment of two enemies weeping in the same tent, is where the Iliad ends. The other great Homeric poem simply stops there, on a funeral, with the war still running. But the war did not stop. Achilles himself died soon after, exactly as the prophecy had always promised he would. He was shot down by an arrow from the bow of Paris, guided, the poets said, by the god Apollo, striking the one spot on his body where he could be hurt at all. The heel. The word has carried his name into every language spoken on this planet since. The greatest warrior of the age burned on a pyre on the shore of a foreign sea, in the war he had known would kill him and had chosen anyway, because he had been offered a long quiet life or a short blazing one, and he had picked the one that came with songs. Remember that choice. We are going to meet him again in a place where he has had time to think about it. His death set off one final poisonous quarrel, and it destroyed the second greatest man in the army. The magnificent armour of Achilles, forged by the smith god Hephaestus himself, had to go to someone, and there were exactly two claimants, and both of them deserved it. Great Ajax had carried the body of Achilles out of the fighting on his own shoulders through the whole Trojan army, which is a feat that borders on the impossible and was witnessed by everyone. Odysseus had held off the Trojans while he did it, standing and fighting the pursuit alone so that the body could be saved. Neither claim was weak. The army was asked to judge between them, and in some versions the votes of captured Trojan prisoners were used as a tiebreaker, on the reasonable grounds that the enemy would know best which of the two had hurt them more. The armour went to Odysseus. The mind, in the end, was valued over the muscle, and the whole army had said so out loud. Ajax could not survive it. This was a man whose entire identity was built on being the strongest and steadiest man in Greece after Achilles, and the assembly had just told him, publicly, that he came second to a talker. That night his mind gave way. Athena, the poem says, clouded his sight, and he went out in the dark with his sword and fell upon the army's herds of sheep and cattle, slaughtering them by the hundred, convinced with absolute clarity that he was butchering Agamemnon and Odysseus and every commander who had wronged him. He took prisoners. He tied animals to the tent post and flogged them, believing they were men. When the sun came up and the madness lifted and he stood there in the middle of a field of carcasses with the blood drying on his arms and understood what he had actually done and what the army would see when they came looking, the shame was more than a man of his kind could carry. He planted his sword in the earth with the point upward and fell on it. The Greeks had lost their second greatest warrior, and they had not lost him to Troy. They had lost him to their own prize-giving ceremony. To his credit, and the tradition is firm about this, Odysseus argued afterward that Ajax deserved a full and honourable burial over Agamemnon's objections that a man who had tried to murder his own commanders had forfeited the right. He had wanted the armour. He had not wanted this. So the 10th year found the Greek army victorious in almost every way that did not actually matter. Their best fighters were dead or spent. Achilles was ashes. Great Ajax was ashes. Patroclus, Antilochus, and a long list of names that meant something to somebody were all gone. On the other side, Hector was dead. Paris himself was eventually killed by an arrow. And the city had been stripped of most of its allies and was hungry behind its own gates. But the walls still stood, the gates still held, and in 10 years of continuous war, no Greek had ever set foot inside the city. By this point the Greeks had turned to prophecy, working through a list of conditions that had to be met before Troy could fall, ticking them off like items on an increasingly desperate inventory. Fetch the bow of Heracles from the island where its owner had been abandoned. Bring the young son of Achilles into the war. Steal the Palladium out of the temple. Odysseus arranged every one of them. He sailed for the bow himself and talked its bitter, crippled owner into forgiveness. He fetched the boy. He went over the wall for the statue, and still the city stood. 10 years of blood had proved one thing beyond any argument. Troy could not be taken by force. If it was ever going to fall, it would have to fall to something else entirely. And down on the shore by the ships, the man who had spent a decade as the brain of that army began turning over an idea. It involved carpentry, an empty beach, one very brave liar, and the most famous piece of livestock in human history. When Odysseus finally laid the plan out in front of the other commanders, it must have sounded like a joke, or an insult, or possibly the first symptom of a man cracking under strain. The mightiest army ever assembled had failed to break this city in 10 years of open war, and the new plan was to stop trying. Instead, the Greeks would pretend to give up. They would sail away, and they would leave behind a present. Here is how it actually worked, and the design of it is worth admiring even now, because every single element does a job. Under the direction of a master craftsman named Epeius, and reportedly with guidance from Athena herself, the Greeks built an enormous hollow horse out of wooden planks, tall as a siege tower, polished, decorated, finished to the standard of a temple offering rather than a piece of military equipment, because it had to read instantly and unmistakably as a sacred gift rather than a machine. Inside the belly was a hidden compartment with room for a picked force of armed men. The number changes depending on which ancient source you read, anywhere from a couple of dozen up to 50 or more. But every single version agrees on one detail. Every version agrees on who commanded them. Odysseus climbed into his own idea and sat in the dark inside it, with the best remaining warriors in Greece packed shoulder to shoulder around him. Then the army did the hard part, which was not the building, it was the leaving. The Greeks burned their camp to the ground. They dragged the ships down the beach and into the water, and they sailed away in full view of the walls of Troy, in daylight, so that every watchman on every tower could see it happening, leaving the great horse standing alone on an empty smoking shore. The fleet did not go home. It went just over the horizon to the island of Tenedos and anchored there out of sight, and waited. And one man stayed behind on purpose. His name was Sinon, and he volunteered for what may be the bravest and least celebrated job in the entire war. His task was to be captured. Think about what that actually meant. He had to be found by soldiers from a city that had spent 10 years watching its sons die because of men like him. And then he had to hold a lie together, alone, under interrogation, with no support and no way out, knowing exactly what would happen to him the moment anybody stopped believing it. They found him hiding in the marshes, dragged him to the city in ropes, and brought him before the king. And Sinon told them the story of his life. He said the Greeks had finally given up and sailed for home. He said they had left the horse behind as an offering to Athena to atone for the theft of the palladium from her temple, which the Trojans knew perfectly well had happened. Then he added the detail that did the real work. He said the Greeks had built it deliberately enormous so that the Trojans could never get it through their gates. Because there was a prophecy, he explained, that if that horse ever stood inside the walls of Troy, the city could never be taken by anyone ever again. And finally he wept and said that the Greeks had intended to sacrifice him, personally, to buy a safe voyage home, and that he had escaped in the night and now hated his own countrymen more than any Trojan ever could. Look at the architecture of that lie, because it was almost certainly designed by the man sitting in the dark inside the horse. It does not ask the Trojans to accept the horse. It does not push at all. Every single element is engineered to make them want it. It gives them a reason the object exists. It gives them a defector to trust. And then it tells them the one thing that guarantees they will not merely tolerate this gift, but will tear their own city apart to bring it inside. Which is that their enemies specifically do not want them to have it. The best lies do not push. They pull. Not everyone in Troy was fooled. A priest named Laocoon stood up and warned against the whole thing with a line that has outlived the language it was spoken in, saying that he feared the Greeks even when they came bearing gifts. And to prove his point, he took a spear and hurled it into the flank of the horse, where it stuck, quivering, in the wood. Inside, in the dark, several dozen men held their breath and did not make a sound, and then, in front of the entire city, 2 enormous serpents came out of the sea and crushed Laocoon and both of his sons to death on the shore. The Trojans read it exactly the way anyone in that world would have read it. A man had insulted a sacred offering to a goddess, and the goddess had answered within the hour. It was not ambiguous. It was not debatable. It was divine judgment delivered in public, and it settled the argument permanently. Then Cassandra, the princess who had been cursed by Apollo to always prophesy the truth and never once be believed, ran into the street crying out that the horse was full of armed men and that the city was about to burn. And Troy laughed at her. The way it always did, they breached their own wall to bring the prize inside, taking down stone that had held for 10 years with their own hands. They hauled the horse up to the citadel with ropes and rollers. They wreathed it in flowers. And then they threw the biggest party in the history of the city. 10 years of siege were over. That was the only fact anybody in Troy needed that night. They drank the way people drink when a war ends, not the way you drink at a feast, carefully, with the wine cut 3 or 4 parts water as any civilized household would serve it. They drank the way a city drinks when the thing it has been braced against for a decade suddenly is not there anymore, and the muscles that have been clenched for 10 years all let go at once. By the small hours, Troy was asleep for the first time in a decade. Properly asleep. Not the shallow, listening sleep of a city under siege, but the deep, boneless sleep of relief. The watch, such as it was drunk or gone. Inside the horse, in the dark, in the stink of a few dozen armoured men who had been sitting motionless for the better part of a day, there had been one final test of nerve. And it is one of the eeriest scenes in the whole tradition. Helen herself had come down to the horse that evening. Nobody has ever been able to explain quite why. Suspicion, perhaps, mischief, or some divided loyalty of her own. A woman who had been the property of 2 cities and was owned by neither. She walked around the horse in the torchlight, slowly running her hand along the planks. And then she began to call out to the men she suspected were inside, and she called to them in the voices of their own wives. She imitated them perfectly, one after another, saying their names. Understand what that meant to the men inside. These were men who had not seen their homes in 10 years. Men who had been trying on cold nights to remember exactly how a particular voice sounded and had begun to lose it. And that voice was suddenly outside the wood, 6 feet away, saying their name. One of the warriors nearly answered. He opened his mouth to answer his wife. Odysseus clamped a hand over that man's mouth and held it there, in the dark, in total silence, until Helen finally gave up and walked away. In some later tellings he held on so long and so hard that he strangled the man rather than let a single sound escape. That is probably a later embroidery on the story, and I hope it is. But it captures something true about that night. Everything hung on silence. The war, the fleet, every life in that horse, and the entire outcome of a 10-year siege, all of it balanced on nobody making a noise. Deep in the night, Sinon slipped away from his new hosts and lit a signal fire. Out at Tenedos the fleet saw it, and turned and came back for the shore under oars in the dark. And up in the citadel, a hatch opened in the belly of the horse, and a rope ladder dropped, and Odysseus and his men came down into the sleeping heart of Troy. They killed the few sentries who were still upright. They opened the gates. And the army came in. What followed was not a battle. Nobody who tells this story honestly calls it a battle. It was the sack of a city, and the ancient sources do not soften a single detail of it, because they were not written to make anybody feel good. The Trojans woke to fire and screaming and armed men already inside their houses. Some of them fought back magnificently and hopelessly, half-armed, in doorways and courtyards and on stairs, and died there. Priam's palace became a slaughterhouse. The old king himself put on armour that his body could no longer carry, an old man trying to lift a spear he had not held in 20 years, and his wife Hecuba pulled him away from it and drew him to the household altar, the most sacred place of refuge in his world. A man at an altar was under the direct protection of the gods. Everyone knew that. It was the oldest rule there was. It did not save him. Neoptolemus, the teenage son of dead Achilles, killed Priam at the altar itself, and that single act was remembered for the next 1,000 years as one of the great sacrileges of that terrible night. And there were others, and the poets recorded them the way a court clerk records charges. Cassandra, the princess nobody believed, ran to the temple of Athena and wrapped her arms around the statue of the goddess, which was the strongest sanctuary a woman could claim. A Greek commander called Ajax the Lesser, a completely different man from the great Ajax, tore her away from it and violated her there, inside the sanctuary, at the feet of the goddess. Hector's small son Astyanax was thrown from the walls. He was killed as a child specifically, so that he could never grow up into an avenger, which is a decision somebody in that army had to make deliberately, in cold blood, about a toddler. And the women of the royal house, queens and princesses of the richest city in that part of the world, were divided among the victors as property. Andromache, Hector's widow, was given to the son of the man who had killed her husband. Hecuba, the old queen, was given to Odysseus. By morning Troy was a smoking ruin, and everything the Greeks had come for was in the holds of their ships. Helen was returned to Menelaus, who had spent 10 years swearing to everyone who would listen that he would kill her the moment he saw her, and who found, standing in front of her, that he could not. Now here is the turn in the story that ancient audiences understood instinctively, and that we need to understand tonight, because absolutely everything that follows depends on it. The Greeks won the war, and in the winning of it, they lost the gods. Greek religion was not a religion of mercy. It never claimed to be, but it was very much a religion of limits. Altars were sacred. Temples were sacred. Suppliants, people who had physically placed themselves under a god's protection by grasping an altar or a statue or the knees of the person they were begging, were untouchable. Those were not suggestions. They were the load-bearing walls of the entire moral universe. On the night Troy fell, the victors broke every single one of them. Drunk on 10 years of accumulated rage and grief, they broke them all in the space of a few hours, and Athena, who had backed the Greeks through the entire war, who had helped design the horse itself, who had personally guided the whole enterprise from the beginning, turned against them overnight. Because of what was done to Cassandra in her own temple, at the feet of her own statue. When the army then failed to punish Ajax the Lesser for it, when they held a debate about it and let him walk, her anger settled on the entire fleet. And so the homecomings became a second catastrophe, and in some ways a worse one than the war. The Greeks quarrelled bitterly among themselves before they had even finished loading the ships, and the fleet split in anger rather than sailing home together. Storms scattered the pieces of it across the eastern Mediterranean. Ajax the Lesser was shipwrecked, dragged himself half-drowned onto a rock, and then stood up and shouted that he had survived in spite of the gods, that no god had managed to kill him. Poseidon heard the remark, split the rock underneath him with his trident, and dropped him into the sea. Menelaus was blown all the way to Egypt and wandered for 7 years before he saw Sparta again. And Agamemnon reached home quickly, which turned out to be the worst luck of any of them. His wife Clytemnestra had spent 10 years in that palace, remembering a girl on an altar at Aulis. She met him at the harbour. She spread a crimson cloth on the ground for him to walk on, an honour so excessive it was practically an accusation. She led him into his own house and drew him a hot bath after his long journey, and in that bath, tangled in a net she had prepared, the High King of the Greeks, the conqueror of Troy, was hacked to death on the day of his return, in his own home, by his own wife and her lover. 10 years of war survived, and he did not last one afternoon in his own bathroom. Hold on to that story too. Odysseus is going to hear it later from a very unusual source, and it is going to change how he walks through his own front door. And Odysseus himself, the man who had built the horse and won the war, put out to sea from the ruins of Troy with 12 ships and roughly 600 men, expecting like everybody else to be home within a few weeks. The gods had other plans, and so, to be entirely fair about it, did Odysseus, because a great deal of what happens next is nobody's fault but his own. The city he had burned was going to be avenged, not by armies and not by any Trojan. It would be avenged by geography, by weather, by appetite, and by one very large and extremely angry shepherd. The fleet set sail. 12 ships stood off the Trojan shore in the early summer light, riding low in the water under the weight of 10 years of plunder, Each one was a black-hulled galley of the Bronze Age type, perhaps 50 men to a ship, a single mast carrying one square sail, and benches of rowers for when the wind failed or died or turned. There were no decks to sleep under, no cabins, no compass, because the compass would not exist for another 2,000 years. No charts in any sense we would recognise. Sailors of that age navigated by coastline, by landmark, by the stars, and above all by accumulated memory, their own and other men's, passed down and traded in harbours. And they beached their ships at night whenever they possibly could, because the open sea after dark was no place for sensible men. The route home was simple, and every man aboard could have recited it. Southwest along the coast of Asia Minor. Island hopping across the Aegean. Around the southern capes of Greece. Then north up the western coast to Ithaca, 560 miles or so. A few weeks of ordinary sailing in the sailing season. Some of these men had been teenagers when they left home. They were now in their 30s. Their own sons, like Telemachus, were nearly grown men they had never met. Every hour of sailing was an hour closer to faces they had spent 10 years trying not to forget. And then, at the very first opportunity, they threw it away. The coast of Thrace lay near their route, and on it stood a city called Ismarus, home to a people called the Cicones, who had sent men to fight for Troy. To a Bronze Age war fleet, an enemy city whose army had just been destroyed at Troy was not a place to be avoided. It was a target. And I want to be careful here, because it is easy to judge this with modern eyes and miss what is actually happening. Raiding was not considered piracy in that world. Or rather, piracy existed but was not considered shameful. It was simply what armed men in ships did. It was an accepted, ordinary way for kings to grow rich. And in Homer, you will find characters asking guests, politely and with no hostility at all, whether they are traders or raiders, the way you might ask what someone does for a living. And after 10 years of war, it was practically a reflex. Odysseus gave the order, and the fleet fell on Ismarus. The raid succeeded exactly the way these things succeeded. The town was sacked. Its men were killed. Its women and its treasure were divided among the crews by the usual rules. And when Odysseus tells this story later, in his own voice, he is completely matter-of-fact about all of it. This is worth stopping on, because it is our first clear look at the hero outside the context of the war. And he does not look much like a hero at all. He looks like exactly what he is, which is a Bronze Age warlord doing ordinary Bronze Age warlord things. The Odyssey does not apologise for this. It does not explain it away or soften it. It simply shows it to you. And then it shows you the bill. Odysseus, reading the situation the way he always reads situations, gave the order to withdraw immediately. Get the loot aboard, get the men aboard, get off this beach. The crews refused. There was wine on that beach. There were sheep and cattle already slaughtered. And after 10 years of army rations and siege food, 600 men looked at all of it and decided that they were going to have their feast. So they ate and they drank through the afternoon and on into the evening and into the night. And while they did, the survivors of Ismarus were slipping away inland to their kinsmen, the Cicones of the interior, who turned out to be numerous, warlike, and rather good with chariots. At dawn the counterattack came, and it came in numbers that Homer compares to leaves in springtime. The Greeks, heavy with wine and mutton and half asleep, had to form up on an open beach with their backs to the water against fresh troops who had marched all night. To their credit, they held through the morning. That is not nothing. But by afternoon the line broke, and the crews scrambled for the ships under attack, hauling off the shore with spears falling into the water around them. When they were clear and had time to count heads, the arithmetic was brutal. 6 men lost from every single ship. 72 dead, give or take, traded for a pile of loot and one night's party. The fleet pulled away in silence. And Odysseus records that they called the names of every dead man 3 times across the water before setting course. so that the ghosts would not be left behind on that beach unmourned. It is an ugly little episode, and it is placed at the very front of the voyage on purpose, before a single monster appears, before any god intervenes, before anything supernatural happens at all. The pattern of the entire journey is laid out in miniature at Ismarus. Odysseus gives a sound order. The crew disobeys it for the sake of appetite. Men die. Remember that pattern tonight, because you are going to watch it repeat at larger and larger scale until there is nobody left. The fleet ran southwest with a following wind, licking its wounds, and made for the southern tip of Greece. They passed the island of Cythera and came at last to the final obstacle on the route home, a headland called Cape Malea, the southeastern fingertip of the Greek mainland. And here we have to talk about real geography for a moment, because Cape Malea is not a legend. It is a real place, it is on every modern chart, and it has been feared by real sailors for as long as there have been ships. The mountains behind the Cape funnel and twist the wind. The currents around it are treacherous and unpredictable, and weather coming down from the north can hurl a vessel away from land faster than any number of oars can answer. The ancient Greeks had a proverb about it: round Malea and forget your home. In the age of sail, ships wrecked there by the hundred. Modern archaeologists have found the seafloor around that cape littered with cargoes spanning thousands of years, layer on layer of other people's worst days. Odysseus and his 12 ships reached Malea, turned the corner, and were as close to home as they would come for a decade. Ithaca was perhaps a week away. Some of these men could have named every beach between here and their own front doors. Then the north wind came down like a fist. The storm caught the fleet at the worst possible point on the entire route and drove them bodily away from the cape. South, past Cythera, and out into open water. For 2 days and 2 nights they ran before it, with their sails torn, unable to claw back a single mile. On the 3rd day the sky cleared, and they raised what canvas they had left and tried to beat back north. The wind and the current simply would not allow it. 9 days, Odysseus says. 9 days the winds carried them across the fish-filled sea, away from every coastline that any man aboard had ever seen or heard described in any harbour anywhere. Those 9 days are the poem's way of drawing a line on the map and then erasing the map. Everything before Cape Malea is real geography that you could visit this year. Troy, Ismarus, Cythera, the Cape itself. You can stand on all of it. Everything after it belongs to a different kind of space entirely. A sea of islands that appear on no chart, populated by beings that follow no human rules. Ancient readers argued endlessly about where these places were supposed to be, pinning the Lotus Eaters hopefully to Libya and the Cyclops to Sicily, drawing maps and defending them. And the geographer Eratosthenes, a very sensible man who calculated the circumference of the earth to within a few % using shadows and arithmetic, said that you would find the route of Odysseus on the day you found the cobbler who stitched the bag of the winds. He meant that you would not. For the men on those ships, of course, this was not a literary transition. It was a slow, dawning dread. Bronze Age sailors lived by known coasts the way we live by roads. And they were now, beyond all of them, running on guesswork, with the waterskins going flat. And no idea at all what shore might rise ahead of the bow or what would be waiting on it. 10 years of war had at least been 10 years in a known place, with known enemies. On a beach you could describe to your father. This was something new. This was the particular fear of being lost, which is a completely different animal from the fear of being attacked, and in some ways a worse one, because there is nothing to fight. On the 10th day, a low green coastline lifted over the horizon. The ships ran in, found fresh water, and the exhausted crews ate whatever they had left on the beach. It seemed a gentle place. No walls, no chariots, no spear points glinting on the hillsides, nothing but green. Odysseus, cautious now after Ismarus, did not land the whole force. He picked 2 sailors and a herald, 3 men, and sent them inland with the simplest instructions in the world. Find out who lives here, and whether they eat bread. That was the Greek way of asking whether the inhabitants were civilized human beings, because bread means grain, and grain means farming, and farming means settled people with laws and altars and customs you can negotiate with. The three men walked into the green interior of that country, and they did not come back. The people of that coast were called the Lotus Eaters, and by every outward measure they were the kindest hosts Odysseus would meet on his entire voyage. They did not attack the scouts, they did not rob them or enslave them or hold them for ransom. They welcomed the strangers, sat them down, and shared their food, which is precisely and exactly what the sacred law of hospitality asked of them. If you were grading these people on senior, they would score higher than almost anyone else in the poem. The food was the fruit of the lotus, a sweet flowering plant that appears to have been the whole of their diet, and as far as anyone could tell, the whole of their civilization. And whoever ate it stopped wanting to go home. That is the entire mechanism of the episode, and it is the quietest horror in the book. The lotus did not poison the body. It did not enslave the will. The three scouts were awake, healthy, comfortable, and perfectly genuinely content. Nobody was holding them. They simply no longer cared about Ithaca. The wives and the children they had spent 10 years fighting to get back to had faded into a kind of pleasant irrelevance. Like a story about someone else. Like something they had read once. All they wanted was to stay exactly where they were, among the lotus eaters, eating lotus, forever. And when you consider what these particular men had already endured just to get this far, the war, the storm, the beach at Ismarus, their friends' names called 3 times over the water, there is something almost merciful in it. The lotus offered them the one thing no god in that entire cosmos had ever offered anybody: an end to wanting. Odysseus understood the danger immediately, and what he did about it tells you a great deal about him. He did not negotiate. He did not send more men in to find the first 3. And he certainly did not sample the fruit himself to assess the threat, which is exactly what a certain kind of curious man would have done, and which he would absolutely have done a few weeks earlier. He went in personally with a rescue party. He seized the 3 weeping scouts by force, dragged them back to the ships while they begged and pleaded to be allowed to stay, and tied them down to the rowing benches. Then he ordered every other man aboard immediately, before anybody else could get near the fruit, and the fleet pulled away from that gentle coast at speed, with 3 of its sailors lashed to the benches and sobbing for the shore. It is a small episode, barely 20 lines in Homer. No battle, no body count, nobody dies, and yet the poet placed it first among all the strange encounters of the voyage, ahead of the giants and the witch and the monsters and the land of the dead. Thinkers have been unpacking that decision ever since. Because the Lotus Eaters establish what the Odyssey is actually about, and it is not seafaring. It is memory, and the terrible ongoing effort of continuing to want something difficult when something easy is sitting right in front of you. Look at the shape of the threat. Every other danger on this voyage attacks the body. The giant eats you. The whirlpool drowns you. The thunderbolt burns you. The lotus attacks the homecoming itself. The desire for it, the engine that makes the entire journey mean anything at all. A man killed by a monster dies on his way home. That is a tragedy, but it is a tragedy inside a story that still has a direction. A man who eats the lotus is worse than dead in the poem's own terms, because the way home no longer exists inside him. Nothing has been taken from him except the wanting, and without the wanting, he is not going anywhere. He is simply alive, indefinitely, pleasantly, in a place that is not his. The Greeks had a word that sits at the exact centre of this poem. Nostos. It means homecoming, the return of a man across the sea to his own country. It was an entire genre. There were whole poems, now lost, called the Nostoi, the returns, about the various homecomings after Troy. Now pair that word with another Greek word, algos, which means pain. Put them together and you get a word that was actually coined thousands of years later, in the 17th century, by a Swiss medical student trying to name the wasting sickness he saw in soldiers serving far from home. Nostalgia, the ache for return. He thought it was a disease, and honestly, watching those three men sob on the benches, you can see why. The Odyssey is the founding document of that ache. And the Lotus Eaters are its founding warning, which is that the ache can be cured, and that the cure is a kind of death. Odysseus drags his men back to their benches, not because the lotus will hurt them, but precisely because it will make them stop hurting, and the hurt is the only compass they have left. It is also worth noticing very carefully who ate and who did not. The scouts ate, Odysseus did not. And through this entire voyage, that pattern is going to hold. The crew reaches for whatever is in front of them: food, wine, plunder, sleep, comfort, safety, and Odysseus, whatever his other failings, and he has many, keeps choosing the difficult thing that is further away, not because he is immune to temptation. Later tonight you are going to watch him extremely tempted indeed. By comfort, by a goddess, by glory, eventually by immortality itself. But he can hold a future in his mind vividly enough to outweigh a present pleasure. And most of his men, brave as they are, and they are brave, simply cannot. In the arithmetic of this poem, that single capacity, more than strength and more than courage, is what separates the one man who gets home from the 600 who do not. People have wondered for a very long time whether a real plant hides behind the story, and the ancients wondered too. Herodotus, the great traveller and historian, reported a people on the coast of North Africa who lived on the sweet fruit of a real shrub and were called by the Greeks the lotus eaters. That plant still grows there. It is a modest relative of the jujube, pleasant, mildly sweet, and entirely harmless, which rather undersells the legend. Others have proposed the blue water lily of the Nile, which does have mild sedative properties and shows up constantly in Egyptian art. Others have pointed at the opium poppy, which was known and cultivated around the Bronze Age Mediterranean and whose effect on a man's motivation needs no elaboration from me. The honest answer is that Homer was not writing botany. Whatever seed of traveller's gossip started the tale, the poet turned it into something no actual plant could ever be. A pure image of forgetting, and it is as instantly recognizable now as it was 27 centuries ago, because every single age since has had no trouble at all naming its own lotus. The fleet stood out to sea and left those people exactly as it had found them, mild, generous, and going nowhere. The only inhabitants of this entire epic who never harmed anyone and never will. Behind the ships their green country sank slowly into the haze. On the benches the three rescued men wept themselves quiet. And then, as the fruit's hold faded with distance, they slowly came back to themselves and to their oars, remembering, perhaps with genuinely mixed feelings, that they had wives and debts, and a very long way still to go. Ahead lay open water, and then in time another landfall. This one did not look gentle, and it was not. A rugged coastline of mountains and forest under a smoke-grey sky. The Greeks could see, even from a distance, that the people here planted nothing and ploughed nothing. There were no ships drawn up on the beaches, no walls, no assembly place, no temples, no smoke from a common hearth. Nothing that indicated that anybody here had ever sat down with anybody else to agree on a rule. What they could see were caves. The mouths of great caves high in the cliffs, and folds and pens for enormous flocks, and here and there on the slopes, figures moving that had to be a trick of the light and the distance, because they were far too large to be men. Odysseus looked at that shore, and his curiosity, the trait that made him great and was about to cost him more than any storm ever would, began to stir. There was a smaller island lying just offshore, wooded, uninhabited, full of wild goats that had never seen a human being, and therefore had no idea they should run. It was safe, empty, and had good water. The sensible thing was obvious. Water the ships there, eat some goat, and leave before anybody on that mainland noticed 12 ships had arrived. The fleet did anchor there, and they did feast on the goats, and they slept well for the first time in a long while. And then in the morning Odysseus announced that he would take his own ship, only his own, across to the mainland to find out what manner of beings lived in those caves, whether they were savage or civilized, whether they feared the gods, and whether they gave gifts to guests. He was going to get answers to all 3 questions. They were the worst answers available. He crossed with one ship and picked 12 of his best men for the shore party, leaving the rest to guard the vessel on the beach. He also brought something that seems, at first glance, like a strange item to pack for a reconnaissance: a goat skin of extraordinarily strong wine. It had been a gift from a priest of Apollo at Ismarus, whose family Odysseus had personally spared during the sack. And it was famous stuff. Dark, sweet, and so powerful that its owner mixed it 1 part wine to 20 parts water, which is roughly 6 times weaker than the already diluted wine ordinary Greeks drank at dinner. Undiluted, it was less a beverage than a weapon. Odysseus says he took it along because something in his spirit told him he was about to meet a savage stranger, huge and lawless, who knew nothing of justice. File that away, because the wine is the whole story. They found the cave easily. A great cavern in the cliffs near the sea, fenced outside with a yard built of quarried boulders and tall pines. Its owner was out with his flocks. And inside, the Greeks found the home of a very orderly monster. That detail matters more than it looks. Pens of lambs and kids, carefully sorted by age into separate groups, the spring lambs here and the younger ones there. Racks of cheeses in neat rows, pails and bowls of milk and whey, everything clean, everything drained, everything managed. Whoever lived here was not a beast. He was a competent, systematic dairy farmer who simply happened to be enormous. The crew looked at the cheeses and had honestly the single best idea anyone has in this entire poem. They wanted to grab some cheese, drive off a few lambs to the ship, and sail away immediately. Odysseus refused, and he tells us why, later, with a flatness that has been making readers wince for 3,000 years. He wanted to see the owner. He wanted to know whether the man would give him a guest gift. 10 years of war had taught him everything except when to stop being curious. So they lit a fire, helped themselves to the cheese, and sat down in a stranger's house to wait for him. The host came home at evening, driving his flocks in front of him, and carrying an enormous load of firewood on his back, which he flung down inside the cave with a crash that sent 12 armed veterans scrambling for the shadows at the back. Then he drove the ewes in for milking, and rolled a boulder across the entrance behind them. A stone so vast, Homer says, that 22 four-wheeled wagons could not have shifted it. And in the firelight, the Greeks got their first clear look at the man whose cheese they had eaten. His name was Polyphemus. He was a cyclops, one of a race of one-eyed giants who lived scattered across those hills, each family in its own cave, answerable to nobody, with no assemblies, no laws, and no interest in one another's business. And, as it would shortly turn out to matter enormously, he was a son of Poseidon. He milked his ewes and goats in perfect order, curdled half the milk for cheese, set the rest aside for his supper, and then built up the fire, and by its light he saw the men. The exchange that follows is one of the most chilling scenes in ancient literature, and it is chilling precisely because it begins as etiquette. Odysseus stepped forward and made a proper speech. The correct speech, the one that had worked on every civilist shore in the Greek world. They were Greeks, he said, homeward bound from Troy, driven off course by the sea. They had come to his knees as suppliants, hoping for hospitality, or for a guest gift, as is the custom among men. And then he reminded the giant, politely but clearly, that Zeus himself protects strangers, that Zeus walks with suppliants, and that he avenges wrongs done to guests. Polyphemus was not impressed. He told the little man in front of him that the Cyclopes cared nothing for Zeus, nothing for any of the gods, because they were stronger than the gods. And then he asked casually, almost as an afterthought, where the ship was moored. And Odysseus, lying smoothly even in that moment, even with his life in the room, said that the ship had been wrecked on the rocks, that the sea god had smashed it against the headland, that these 12 men were the only survivors of the entire crew. That lie saved his ship and probably saved the rest of his men, and he made it up on the spot while looking at a creature that could pick him up in one hand. Polyphemus made no reply to it at all. Instead he lunged, snatched up 2 of the sailors, 1 in each fist, dashed their brains out against the stone floor, tore them apart and ate them, bones and all, while their comrades wept and raised their hands to a Zeus who did not intervene. Then he washed the meal down with milk, stretched out among his sheep, and went to sleep. Now, consider Odysseus's position in that moment, because it is a genuinely perfect trap. He had his sword, he was standing over a sleeping giant with his hand on the hilt, and he tells us that he was seriously tempted to feel for the spot beneath the ribs and drive the blade into the liver. And he stopped himself with one piece of cold reasoning. The boulder. If Polyphemus died in his sleep, the door of that cave would stay shut forever, because all 12 men together could not have shifted that stone in a year of trying. Killing the monster meant starving to death beside his corpse in the dark. The prison and the jailer had to be kept alive. Whatever escape existed would have to leave the giant able to open the door, and either unwilling or unable to stop them going through it. Step back and look at that. It is an elegant logic problem, being solved in the dark by a man who is listening to his friends being digested. Morning came, and Polyphemus had 2 more sailors for breakfast, then drove his flocks out to pasture and rolled the boulder back into place behind him, as easily as a man caps a quiver. And through that long day, locked in, Odysseus built his plan. There was a great club of green olive wood lying in the cave, as big as the mast of a 20-oared merchant ship, cut and set aside to dry. He measured off a length of it, about 6 feet, and had his men shave it smooth. He sharpened one end to a point himself, and hardened that point in the embers, and then they hid the whole thing under the dung heaps on the cave floor. Then they drew lots for the 4 men who would help him drive it, and Odysseus notes, dryly, that the lots fell on exactly the 4 men he would have chosen anyway. Evening came, the flocks came in, the boulder went back, and the giant ate 2 more men, 6 gone now out of 12. And now the wine. Odysseus filled a wooden bowl with the priest's undiluted vintage and carried it up to the giant, and offered it to him politely as a gift, wine to go with the meal of human flesh. Polyphemus drained it and demanded more, and more again. 3 bowls of a wine that a grown man would ordinarily drink, diluted 20 to 1. And then, mellowing horribly, he offered his guest a gift in return, and he asked his name. The answer Odysseus gave is the most famous lie in Western literature. My name, he said, is nobody. That is what my mother and my father call me. That is what all my friends call me. Nobody, and Polyphemus, drunk and enormously pleased with his own wit, announced the guest gift he had promised. He would eat nobody last. After all his companions, that was the gift. Then he toppled backward and passed out, so deep in wine that he vomited in his sleep. The Greeks pulled the stake from its hiding place and held the point in the embers until the green wood was glowing and about to catch. Odysseus says a god breathed courage into them then, and they needed it. 4 men lifted the beam. Odysseus guided the point and leaned on it from above, spinning it the way a shipwright spins a drill with a strap, while his mates hold the shaft steady, and the eye hissed around the burning point, Homer says, the way hot iron hisses when a smith plunges it into cold water to temper it. That is the image the poet chose, not a battlefield image, a workshop image, something every listener had heard 100 times in an ordinary week. Polyphemus woke screaming, tore the stake out of his face, and bellowed for help. and his fellow Cyclopes came running through the night from their own caves in the hills and gathered outside the sealed boulder, calling in to him. What was wrong? Was somebody stealing his flocks? Was somebody killing him by treachery or by force? And from inside the cave came the answer, screamed in agony. Nobody is killing me. Nobody by treachery. His neighbours considered this. Well, they reasoned, if nobody is harming you, then this is sickness sent from Zeus, and there is nothing anyone can do about that. Pray to your father Poseidon. And they went back to bed. The trap of the name had sprung perfectly. The victim's own cry for help had personally dismissed his rescuers, but the blinded giant still held the door. He rolled the boulder aside and then sat down in the entrance himself, with his arms spread wide across the opening, feeling for anyone who tried to slip out among the sheep. He may have been a monster, but he was not a fool, and he had worked out the obvious escape route within about a minute of losing his eye. So Odysseus produced his second device. Working quietly in the depths of the cave, he lashed the giant's big woolly rams together in threes, using willow branches taken from the monster's own bed. Under the belly of each middle ram he tied one of his men, with the 2 flanking rams shielding him on either side. For himself, he took the biggest ram in the flock, and simply clung underneath it by hand, face upward, buried in the fleece, hanging on. At dawn the flocks pushed out to pasture as they always did, and Polyphemus stroked the back of every single animal as it passed him, running his hands along the wool, and felt nothing but wool. His favourite, the great ram carrying Odysseus, came last, and the giant paused and put his hands on it and spoke to it. He wondered aloud why the leader of the flock was walking slowly today, when he was always first out. He asked whether the animal was grieving for its master's eye. He said that if the ram could only think and speak, it would tell him where Nobody was hiding, and then he described in some detail what he would do to Nobody when he found him. And then he let it through. Sometimes the most unsettling moment in a horror story is the tender one. Beyond the boulder, out of arm's reach, the Greeks untied themselves and ran for the ship, driving the fat rams ahead of them, and pulled hard for open water. 6 men fewer than they had come with. But alive and free and clear. And that should have been the end of it. It very nearly was. The ship pulled away from that shore with the oars beating fast and the stolen rams bleating in the hold. Behind them, on the cliff top, the blinded giant was feeling his way along the rocks, following the only thing he had left to follow, which was the sound of the rowing. The sensible course was silence. Every stroke brought distance, and distance was safety. And every man at the oars understood that perfectly. Odysseus could not help himself. When the ship was about as far offshore as a man's shout can carry, he stood up and delivered one. Cyclops, he called across the water. If anyone ever asks how you lost your eye, tell them it was your own doing. Tell them you ate your guests in your own house, and Zeus and the other gods have paid you for it. The response was immediate and very nearly fatal. Polyphemus tore the top off a hill and hurled it at the sound of the voice. The rock came down just ahead of the bow, and the wave it threw up drove the ship bodily backward toward the beach, so far and so fast that the crew had to fight the water to get off the land again. The men begged him, in so many words, to stop talking to the giant. Why provoke a creature that throws geography? He did not stop. This is the moment the entire voyage turns on, so let us slow down and watch it happen properly. The ship clawed its way out to roughly twice the previous distance, and Odysseus stood up again, and this time his own shipmates physically got up and tried to hold him back, talking to him the way you talk to someone standing on a ledge, telling him to sit down, telling him it was enough. It was no use. Something in him, and Homer lets us see exactly what it was, needed the monster to know. Cyclops, he shouted across the water, if anyone ever asks who blinded you, tell them it was not Nobody. Tell them it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, whose home is on Ithaca. Name, title, father's name. Home address. He gave the monster everything. To understand why a man that clever would do something that catastrophically stupid, You have to understand what a name actually meant in his world. The trick with nobody had saved 12 lives, but it carried a hidden price that nobody ever mentions when they tell you how clever it was. As long as the giant believed that nobody had beaten him, then in the accounting of fame that Greek heroes lived and died by, nobody had. The deed existed. The credit did not. These men lived for Cleos. Glory, literally, the thing that is heard. Your name attached to your deeds and carried down the generations in song by men like Homer. That was the only immortality available to a mortal in that world, and every hero in this tradition traded actual years of his life for it without hesitating. An anonymous triumph in that currency was worth nothing at all. It was as though it had not happened. So standing in that boat, Odysseus was choosing between safety and signature. He chose signature. It is the exact same appetite that walked him into the cave in the first place, and it was about to be priced accurately. Because here is what he did not know. Polyphemus was not merely an unusually large shepherd. He was a son of Poseidon, god of the sea, shaker of the earth, brother of Zeus, and by any reasonable measure the second most powerful being in the Greek cosmos. And a curse, in Greek belief, was not a vague expression of ill will muttered at the sky. It was closer to a formal legal instrument, a petition addressed to a specific god, requesting a specific outcome against a specific person. And to file one that would actually land, you needed the offender's true name. Odysseus had just shouted his across the water, with his father's name and his home port attached, like a man handing over his complete identification to the opposing counsel in a lawsuit. Polyphemus lifted his hands to the starry sky and prayed, "Hear me, Poseidon, dark-haired encircler of the earth. If I am truly your son, grant that Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, whose home is on Ithaca, may never reach that home. But if it is fated that he must see his own people and his own house again, then let him come late and broken, having lost every one of his companions, on a ship that is not his own. And let him find trouble in his house. Read that curse again, because it is not a curse. It is the plot of the rest of this story, laid out in advance, item by item. Late, broken, every companion lost. A stranger's ship. Trouble in the house. Poseidon heard his son and granted all of it. Then Polyphemus threw a second mountain, which missed the stern and washed the ship helpfully out to sea. And the giant passes out of the story, though absolutely not out of its consequences. There is one more detail from that cave worth carrying with us tonight, because Homer plants it quietly and lets it bloom much later. Among the plunder, Odysseus had kept the great ram that carried him out. And back on the Goat Island, reunited with the rest of the fleet, he sacrificed it to Zeus, burning the thigh bones properly to the king of the gods, and asking for a safe voyage home. And Zeus, the poet tells us flatly, in one short line and with no explanation at all, ignored the sacrifice. The god of guests had watched 6 of his suppliants eaten alive in that cave and had done nothing. But he had also watched the whole affair begin with uninvited men breaking into a stranger's house and helping themselves to his cheese. The gods of this poem keep accounts. Their accounting rarely matches ours. From this point forward, the voyage of Odysseus has an adversary with a specific personal grievance, and it changes the nature of absolutely everything that follows. Storms are no longer weather, currents are no longer chance. The sea itself, the road home, the medium that every single mile of this journey has to cross, belongs to the enemy. Poseidon cannot kill him. Fate, which binds even the gods, has decreed a homecoming, and not even the sea god can overturn that. But everything short of killing him is permitted. And Poseidon has a very long list of things that fall short of killing him. Modern readers often ask whether the punishment fits the crime here, and it is a fair question. Polyphemus ate 6 men alive. Blinding him was self-defence of the plainest possible kind. Even the taunting, reckless as it was, hardly seems to earn 10 years of persecution and 600 deaths. The ancient answer is uncomfortable, but perfectly consistent. The gods do not punish in proportion. They punish in response, according to their own honour and their own attachments and their own hurt feelings. Poseidon is not weighing evidence. He is a father whose son has been mutilated, and he happens to have the power to turn his anger into weather. Part of what the Odyssey teaches, patiently, across its entire length, is the shape of a universe run by beings with human passions and inhuman power, and how a mortal is supposed to survive inside it. And the answer is not innocence. Odysseus is not innocent, and the poem never once pretends he is. The answer is endurance. There is also, hidden in this whole affair, a lesson that Odysseus himself will eventually demonstrate that he learned, though the tuition took him 10 years and everyone he loved outside his own family. The next time we hear him refuse to give his name, and there will be a next time, in a king's hall with everything at stake, he will hold it back through feast after feast, through days of hospitality, through being asked directly, through weeping openly in public, until the precise moment of maximum advantage. And on the day he finally walks into his own house, he will do it as nobody, an anonymous old beggar in his own hall. And he will keep that lid clamped down through insult after insult for days, while men throw furniture at him and mock his rags at his own table. The man who could not stay quiet in a boat for 5 minutes becomes the most patient liar in all of literature. The Odyssey is, among many other things, the story of that education, and this scene is where the bill for it was written. The 12 ships gathered, divided the sheep of Polyphemus fairly among the crews, feasted on the beach, and slept. At dawn they rowed out in formation, grieving for their 6 dead, glad to be alive, and completely unaware that a curse was now travelling with them, written into the water underneath their keels. Their next landfall, for once, looked like straightforward good luck. A floating island, ringed with a wall of bronze, and on it a cheerful king with a very unusual gift to give. For 30 days everything was about to go right. And then a piece of luggage was going to undo the world. The island was called Aeolia, and it was unlike anything the Greeks had ever seen. It floated free on the sea, unanchored to the earth, drifting wherever it liked, and it was ringed by an unbroken wall of bronze rising from sheer cliffs. Its ruler was Aeolus, and Zeus had given him a unique office in the machinery of the world. He was the keeper of the winds. All of them, every gale, every breeze, every hurricane on earth, answered to this one cheerful administrator on his floating island. Aeolus lived there with his wife and their 12 children, 6 sons and 6 daughters, and he had solved the problem of finding suitable matches for them in a remote location by the simple expedient of marrying the 6 sons to the 6 daughters. The whole family feasted together every day in a house full of good things, and Homer reports this arrangement without the flicker of an eyebrow, which perhaps tells us that even the poet decided some questions were better left unasked. More importantly, Aeolus was a good host. A proper one. The first the voyagers had met since leaving Troy. He took Odysseus and all his crews in and entertained them for a full month, and every evening he asked for more of the story. Troy, the horse, the sack, the voyage, the giant, all of it, over and over, the way a man in a remote place will hold on to a visitor who has news. And when the Greeks finally asked leave to go, Aeolus did something that no other host in this entire epic does. He solved the problem. He took the hide of a 9-year-old ox and made from it a great bag. And into that bag he stuffed every wind on earth, except one. The entire howling inventory, the north gales that had wrecked them at Malea. The crosswinds, the squalls, the storms. All of it tied shut inside the leather with a bright silver cord, sealed so tightly that not a single breath could leak out. Then he stowed the bag in the hold of Odysseus's own ship, and set the one remaining wind, a steady gentle westerly, to blow the fleet directly home. It was not really a gift. It was a guarantee. With every contrary wind in the world locked in the hold, there was nothing left in the sky that could stop them. and nothing in the sky did for 9 days and 9 nights the west wind carried those 12 ships east without a single instant. It was the longest stretch of pure, uninterrupted good fortune in the entire 10-year voyage. Odysseus, who by this point trusted nobody, would not let another man touch the sheet that controlled the sail. He steered and managed it himself, day and night, without sleeping, for the whole 9 days. Hold that fact in your mind, because everything hinges on it. 9 days awake, hand on the rope, doing everything personally because it mattered far too much to delegate. On the 10th day they saw Ithaca. Not a distant smudge on the horizon, either. They came in close enough to see the fires burning on their home island. Close enough, the poem implies, to make out the figures of men tending them. 10 years of war. A year of wandering. 600 men reduced by cannibal giants and Ciconian spears. And there it finally was. The actual coastline. The harbours they had learned to swim in. An hour or two of easy sailing away. Some of those fires may have been burning in their own houses, and Odysseus, with the end in sight and the sheet still in his hand, felt 9 sleepless days land on him all at once. He decided the danger was over. He lay down on the deck. And he slept. What happened next happened quietly, in murmurs among the crew, and Homer lets us hear every word of it. There is the captain, asleep at last. And there in the hold is the bag. The mysterious bag he has guarded like treasure the entire way. The bag he will not let anyone touch, or open, or even ask about. Look at him, they said to one another. Everywhere this man goes he is honoured and loaded with gifts. He is carrying home piles of plunder from Troy. And what are we carrying home, after all the same miles and the same fighting? Empty hands. And now Aeolus has given him this, a bag full of silver and gold, no doubt. Let us just look, quickly, and see how much treasure is in there. Try, for a moment, to be fair to them. They had rowed and bled through every single thing their captain had, and they genuinely had nothing to show for it. He had told them nothing about the bag. And secrecy, from a man famous throughout the world for cunning, invites exactly one interpretation. They were not mutineers. They were tired, poor, jealous men within sight of their own chimney smoke, taking one quick, unauthorized look at the luggage. 99 times out of 100, that story ends in embarrassment. They untied the silver cord. Every wind on earth came out of that bag at once. The hurricane that erupted out of the hold seized all 12 ships and hurled them away from Ithaca while the crews howled. And Odysseus woke into the middle of it, woke into the noise, and into the sight of his own island being torn away over the horizon by weather that he had personally carried aboard. He tells us, in his own words, exactly what went through him then. He seriously considered stepping over the side and letting the sea have him. He weighed it, drowning against enduring. And he chose, in his own flat phrase, to endure. He covered his head with his cloak and lay down on the deck and stayed still while the storm blew his life apart. It is perhaps the darkest sentence he speaks in the entire epic. And it is not spoken about a monster, or a god, or a battle. It is spoken about a moment caused by his own crew's pettiness and his own decision. Finally, after 9 days, to sleep. The storm blew the fleet with terrible neatness all the way back to Aeolia, back to the bronze wall and the floating island, back to the exact door they had left 10 days earlier. Odysseus went up to the house with one companion and a herald, found the family at dinner, and sat down on the threshold like a beggar. The astonishment in that hall was total. How could he possibly be here? What evil power had done this to him? And Odysseus told the truth, which for him is always worth noticing. My wretched crew, he said. And sleep. They ruined me. Put it right, my friends, you have the power. The silence that followed was the end of this voyage's luck. Aeolus stood up and ordered him out of the house, and the words he used mattered far more than the eviction itself. "Get off this island at once," he said, "most cursed of all living men. It is against all law for me to help or host a man so plainly hated by the blessed gods. You come back here as proof of their hatred. Go," there it was, spoken aloud for the first time, hated by the gods. Aeolus was a professional in the weather business, and he had examined the facts. A guaranteed fair wind, a 9-day sealed passage, and a hurricane out of a sealed bag within sight of the destination. And he reached the only available diagnosis. This was not misfortune, this was policy. Somewhere in heaven, someone with jurisdiction had it in for this man, and no sensible host anywhere in the world should touch him. The curse from the cliff top was beginning to show its teeth, not as drama, as paperwork. Doors were simply going to close now, everywhere, politely and permanently. The Greeks trudged back to their ships and put out to sea with no wind at all to help them, because the master of the winds had washed his hands of them. For 6 days and 6 nights they rowed in silence, the crews eating their hearts out, in Homer's phrase, over what they had done to themselves. Nobody blamed anyone out loud. There was nothing left to say. The fires of Ithaca had been visible, and now there was only water and the sound of the oars. On the 7th day they raised a coastline, high cliffs enclosing a harbour so sheltered and so still that it seemed to have been designed by Providence for exhausted men. 11 ships rowed gratefully inside and tied up along the walls. Odysseus, for reasons he never quite explains, some instinct scraped raw by the past year, kept his own ship outside the harbour mouth and made it fast to a rock instead. That single decision was about to make him one of the loneliest commanders in the history of the sea. The place was called Telepilus, in the land of the Lastrygonians, and from a sailor's point of view it was perfect. Sheer cliffs wrapping it round on every side, 2 headlands nearly meeting at the entrance, and inside water so flat that no wave ever rose on it. 11 crews looked at that after 6 days at the oars and did the natural thing. They moored close together in the calm and rested. It never seems to have occurred to a single man to ask why a harbour that perfect stood completely empty. No ships, no boats, no town in sight, nothing but a thread of smoke rising somewhere inland. Odysseus asked. He tied up outside, climbed a crag to look over the country, saw nothing but that smoke, and did what he had done on every strange coast since the Lotus Eaters. He sent 3 men to find out who lived there and whether they ate bread. They followed a wagon road inland and met a girl at a spring outside the town, drawing water. A strapping girl, the poem says, the daughter of the local king. They asked her politely who ruled here. She pointed out her family's house. The scouts walked to it and found inside a woman the size of a mountain peak, who took one look at them and called for her husband. The king came home from the assembly, and his idea of receiving foreign visitors was direct. He grabbed one of the sailors and started preparing him for dinner. The other 2 ran for their lives down the wagon road, and behind them the king raised the alarm through the town, and the Lastrygonians came out of their houses. Thousands of them, not human-sized at all. And the giants did not chase the 2 scouts. They did something far more intelligent. They went to the cliffs. Understand the geometry, because it turns a perfect harbour into a perfect trap. 11 ships were moored side by side on still water, enclosed by high rock on every side, with one narrow gate to the sea. The Lastrygonians lined the cliff tops all the way around that basin and began tearing boulders loose and dropping them straight down onto the packed ships below. There was no cover. No sea room to manoeuvre, no wind to sail out on. Nothing underneath the falling stones but wooden hulls and human beings. Homer compresses the massacre into a few terrible lines. The crash of splintering ships, the cries of dying men. And then, the giants wading in to spear the swimmers like fish and carry them off, he says plainly, for their ghastly meal. Odysseus, outside the harbour mouth, could hear all of it and could do nothing. Nothing except one thing. He drew his sword, cut the cable holding his ship to the rock, and shouted his crew onto the oars. And they rowed for open water in terror while the harbour behind them boiled. His ship, the one ship anchored outside, was the only one that escaped. The arithmetic of that afternoon is worth sitting with, because Homer does not dwell on it, and the speed of the telling can hide the scale. 12 ships left Troy. 11 of them, and every man aboard, were destroyed in that harbour in a single hour. Perhaps 500 men. Comrades of 10 years of war and a year of wandering, gone between one meal and the next. The fleet of Ithaca now consisted of one galley and about 45 souls. Everyone else who had sailed away from that island a decade before, the neighbours, the cousins, the boys who had grown into men on the beaches of Troy, ended in the bellies of giants, in a nameless fjord beyond the edge of every map. When the people of Ithaca counted the cost of Troy in later years, this hour was most of it. And notice what saved the one ship, because the poem quietly insists on it. Not strength, not divine favour, certainly not luck. A decision. Odysseus had looked at a perfect harbour and declined it on no evidence at all, purely because a year of catastrophe had taught him that perfect things offered to tired men are usually bait. Paranoia is an ugly word for it. The Odyssey would call it having learned. The captain who fell asleep within sight of Ithaca does not sleep here, and the difference between those two men is 11 ships. The lone survivor fled across empty water, and Homer gives them the strangest, saddest sentence of respite in the whole poem. Glad to have escaped death, he says, but grieving for their dear companions. Glad and grieving in the same breath. Which may be the most honest description of survival anyone has ever written. In time they raised a low-wooded island and beached the ship. For 2 days and 2 nights the survivors simply lay by their vessel and ate their hearts out with exhaustion and grief, doing nothing at all, which after the year they had endured may have been the wisest command Odysseus never had to give. On the 3rd day he took his spear and sword and climbed to a lookout, and saw smoke rising from a house deep in the forest. He debated going straight to it, and decided instead to feed his men first. And Providence for once cooperated. A huge stag crossed his path on the way back down. He killed it, carried it across his shoulders to the beach, and the crew feasted and slept. At dawn he called them together and told them the truth of their position, which was that he had no idea what their position was. Friends, he said, we do not know east from west here. We do not know where the sun sets or where it rises. We are off every chart there is. There was smoke inland. Someone had made it, and the only way forward was to find out who. And the men, hearing this, broke down and wailed aloud, and Homer tells us exactly why. They remembered the last 3 times somebody had gone to see who made the smoke. The Lotus Eaters, the Cyclops, the Lestrygonians. In their direct experience, smoke on the horizon meant that some of them were about to be eaten. It was not cowardice, it was pattern recognition. Odysseus, unmoved, did what commanders do with unbearable decisions. He randomized it. He divided the survivors into 2 platoons of 22 men each, one under himself, the other under his second in command, a big, brave, somewhat unsteady kinsman named Eurylochus. They shook lots in a bronze helmet, and the lot that jumped out was his. So Eurylochus and his 22 marched inland, weeping as they went, and their comrades wept watching them go. And the forest closed behind them. Deep in a clearing they found a house of polished stone, and around it, wonder of wonders, prowled mountain wolves and lions, which did not attack. They rose up on their hind legs and fawned on the visitors like dogs greeting a master coming home from dinner, wagging and cringing in a way that was somehow far worse than a charge. From inside the house came a woman singing, a lovely voice working at a great loom. The men called out. The doors opened on a gracious lady who invited them in for food and rest, and the whole platoon trooped happily inside. All but one. Eurylochus, smelling a trap at last, exactly one house too late in his life for it to do anybody much good, stayed outside and watched through the door. What he saw sent him running back through the forest, so shattered he could barely speak. The lady of the house was named Circe, and the men who had gone in were no longer, strictly speaking, men. The island was called Aea, and its mistress was no ordinary woman. Circe was a goddess, a minor one by Olympian standards, but genuine, a daughter of Helios, the sun itself, and an aunt of the notorious Medea. She lived alone in that stone house with her loom, her singing, her tame predators, and her particular hobby, which Eurylochus had just watched in operation through a doorway. She had welcomed the 22 sailors, seated them, and served them a dish of cheese, barley, honey, and wine, and into it she had stirred a drug that made them forget their native land, and when they had eaten she struck them with a wand, and they became pigs. Bristles, snouts, bodies, voices, everything, except the one thing that mattered. Their minds stayed human. She penned them in her sty, weeping pig tears with complete human understanding of what had happened to them, and threw them acorns, and went back to her weaving. The wolves and the lions in the yard, it was now perfectly clear, had been travellers too. Back at the beach, Eurylochus choked out what he had seen, or as much of it as he could manage, and begged Odysseus to launch the ship immediately, and abandon the transformed men while escape was still possible. From a purely actuarial point of view, that was sound advice. Odysseus refused it. He slung on his sword, took up his bow, and ordered Eurylochus to lead him back to the house. And when the man threw himself down and clutched his knees and refused to go, Odysseus let him stay, and went alone. There is no plan in his head at this point, and the poem is entirely honest about that. One man with a sword was walking up to visit a goddess who turned platoons into livestock, and his entire strategy amounted to being extremely angry about it. He was saved by an intervention. On the forest path a young man appeared, and it was Hermes in disguise, sent, we learn later, at Athena's quiet prompting. Hermes told him plainly that he was walking to his doom, and then, being a practical god, handed him the solution. He pulled a plant out of the earth. The gods called it moly. Black at the root, with a flower white as milk, and hard for mortal men to dig. And then he scripted the scene that had to follow. When her wand falls and nothing happens, draw your sword and rush her as if to kill her. She will offer you her bed. Do not refuse a goddess, but make her swear the great oath of the gods first, to plot no further harm against you, or she will unman you when you are naked and defenceless. It unfolded exactly to script, which is one of the pleasures of having a god write your evening. Circe served the cup. Odysseus drank it down with no effect at all. The wand fell, and instead of trotting off to the sty, the stranger came at her with a drawn sword. Circe shrieked, ducked under the blade, caught his knees, and asked the question that has echoed strangely ever since. "Who are you, that my drugs cannot touch you?" "You must be Odysseus, the man of many turns. Hermes always told me he would come here, on his way home from Troy. It is a chilly little revelation dropped in passing and never explained." The witch had his itinerary in advance. She swore the oath he demanded, and he accepted her offer, and her 4 maidservants bathed the salt off him and laid out a feast. And then Odysseus sat down in front of the food and would not touch it. Circe asked him why. His answer is one of his best moments in the whole poem. How could any decent man eat and drink, he said, while his companions are still penned in a sty? Turn them back, and let me see them with my own eyes. So she went out to the sty with her wand and drove the pigs into the hall and anointed each one with a second drug. And the bristles fell away, and they were men again. Younger, taller, and handsomer than before, the poem insists, and they knew him, and every one of them wept, and the goddess herself was moved by the sound of it. Then Circe did something nobody expected. She invited the rest of the crew. "Bring your ship ashore," she said. "Stow your gear in the caves and bring your men to my house." And Odysseus went back for them, and all but had to drag Eurylochus, who was against it, understandably, having seen the sty from the visitor's side. And the entire surviving company of Ithaca moved in with the witch who had bewitched them. What follows is the strangest passage of time in the Odyssey. They stayed a year, not imprisoned, not enchanted, not, as far as the poem ever tells us, drugged. They feasted every day on abundant meat and sweet wine in the house of a goddess. And the days folded into seasons, and the seasons folded into a full turn of the year, and nobody said the word Ithaca. The men who had wept within sight of their island's fires sat by warm hearths, eating well. And the man who had physically dragged 3 sailors away from a fruit because it caused forgetting settled into a goddess's bed and forgot entirely on his own. No lotus required. Comfort, it turns out, does not need pharmacology. It ended the way these things often end, with the followers nudging the leader. His men took him aside, and their words have a gentle, careful sound to them. The sound of people waking a sleepwalker. Strange man, they said. Remember your homeland now, if it is really fated that you reach it. And he woke up. That evening he went to Circe and asked her to keep her promise and send him home. She did not argue, or weep, or bargain, which sets her apart from nearly everyone else who ever hosted this man. But she told him something that dropped the floor out of the room. You need not stay in my house unwilling, she said. But there is another journey you must make first. Before you can sail home, you must go down to the house of Hades, to the land of the dead, and consult the ghost of the blind prophet Tiresias, who alone among the dead has kept his understanding. He will tell you your way. Odysseus' heart broke. He sat down on the bed and wept and wanted no more of life, and nobody can blame him. No living man had ever made that voyage. Asking for directions home and being told that the route runs through death itself is the cruelest joke the cosmos had played on him yet. When he could speak, he asked the practical question he always asks. Who will pilot us? No ship has ever sailed to Hades. And she gave the eerie answer that no pilot was needed. Raise your mast, set your sail, and sit still. The north wind will carry you. He went. He crossed the river of ocean at the world's edge, past the country of the Cimmerians where the sun never shines, and dug a trench and poured offerings of honey and milk and wine and water, and cut the throats of a black ram and a black ewe over it. And the dead came up out of the dark toward the blood in crowds. Brides who died young. Old men worn out by grief. Girls with fresh sorrow still on them. Ranks of warriors killed in battle, still wearing their blood-stained armour, and a sound around him like a vast inhuman crying. He had to hold his drawn sword over that trench and let none of them drink before Tiresias, which meant, when his own mother came and sat down across from him, a woman who had been alive when he sailed for Troy, he had to hold a blade between himself and her and say nothing and let her wait. Tiresias came at last and drank and told him everything, that Poseidon hated him and would make the road bitter, that he might still come home if he could manage one thing, which was restraint, that he would pass an island where the sun god keeps his cattle, and that if his men touched those cattle, the ship and the crew were finished, and that if he himself survived he would come home late and broken on a stranger's ship, having lost every companion, to find arrogant men eating his goods and courting his wife. Which is Polyphemus's curse, repeated almost word for word. It had been ratified. It was no longer a threat. It was simply the future. Then he let his mother drink, and she knew him, and told him that his father slept in the ashes grieving, and that his wife was faithful and her nights were one long weeping, and that she herself had not died of any sickness. She had died of missing him. 3 times he reached out to hold her, and 3 times she went through his arms like a shadow. He met Agamemnon there, who told him about the bath and the knife and his wife's hand in it, and gave him the advice that would eventually save his life. Come home secretly, not openly. Trust nobody. And he met Achilles, and tried to comfort him by saying he ruled among the dead now. And Achilles gave the answer that detonates the entire value system he died for. Do not talk up death to me, shining Odysseus. I would rather be a hired hand on the farm of a poor man, alive on the earth, than king over all the perished dead. The man who chose a short, glorious life over a long, obscure one had seen the other side of that bargain and wanted his money back. He went down for directions. He came back with a price list. And then, in a rush, because the rest of it comes fast, the poem spends everything it has left. He sailed past the sirens tied to his own mast with his crow's ears plugged with beeswax, having given the standing order that if he begged to be released, they were to bind him tighter, which is the oldest recorded case of a man making a binding decision while sane about what he would be permitted to do while tempted. Philosophers still call that kind of arrangement a Ulysses contract, and it is used in medicine and law to this day. He passed between Scylla and Charybdis, and chose, in the coldest piece of arithmetic in ancient literature, to lose 6 men rather than lose the ship. He watched them lifted screaming above the deck, still calling his name, and there was nothing to do but row. He says it was the most pitiful sight his eyes ever saw in all his years at sea. And then they reached the island of the sun god's cattle. He begged them to sail past. The crew refused, for the first time formally, and he made them swear an oath not to touch the herds. Then the wind turned against them and pinned them on that island for a month, and their food ran out, and the fat, forbidden cattle grazed a spear's throw away, day after day, guarded by nothing but a promise. The gods of this poem do not force men's hands. They arrange circumstances in which a man's own nature will do the forcing, and then they wait. He held them for the entire month. Then he walked inland alone to pray for a way off the island, and the gods answered that prayer by pouring sleep over his eyes. And on the beach behind him, Eurylochus made the speech of his life to a crew of starving men, and they killed the cattle. The hides crawled on the ground, the meat lowed on the spits. They ate it anyway, for 6 days. When they finally sailed, Zeus put a black cloud over the ship and threw a thunderbolt into it, and every man aboard went into the water, and Homer's last image of the crew of Odysseus is of them bobbing around the hull like seabirds until the sea took them one by one. Of the 600 who left Troy, the count of the living stood at 1. He drifted 9 days on a lashed-together mast and keel and washed up on the island of Ogygia, where the goddess Calypso found him, and there he stayed for 7 years, while the world assumed he was dead. She offered him immortality, not metaphorically. She offered to make him ageless and deathless, her husband forever in a garden at the edge of the world, with every terror of the human condition simply cancelled. All he had to do was stop wanting Ithaca. And he said no. Not once, in a grand scene, but continuously, quietly, for 7 years, by sitting on the headland every day, looking east across the water and weeping. When Hermes finally came with Zeus's order to release him, Calypso put the case to him directly and without malice. She told him that if he knew what suffering still lay between here and home, he would stay, and she pointed out, with an immortal's frankness, that she was not inferior to his wife in form or stature, and that mortal women cannot compete with goddesses. And Odysseus answered, "Goddess, I know it. All of it is exactly as you say. Wise Penelope is less than you to look upon, for she is mortal and you are deathless and unaging. But even so, what I want every day is to go home, and to see the day of my return, and if some god wrecks me again on the wine-dark sea, I will bear it. I have suffered much already. Let this be added to the rest." He conceded every single point, and chose Ithaca anyway, a mortal wife over an immortal one, an old age over an eternal youth, a difficult real life over a perfect suspended one. Scholars sometimes say the whole Odyssey is contained in that one exchange, and they are not wrong. He built a raft with his own hands over 4 days, sailed 17 days alone by the stars, was shipwrecked one last time by Poseidon within sight of land, and swam 2 days and 2 nights to crawl ashore naked on the coast of the Phaeacians, where a princess found him and a king gave him a ship. They carried him home asleep and laid him on the sand of his own island, with his treasure stacked beside an olive tree, and after 20 years he arrived unconscious and missed it entirely. And then, disguised as an old beggar by Athena, he walked into his own house. He was recognised by exactly 2 living things before he chose to be. An old nurse, who found the boar scar on his thigh while washing his feet and nearly cried out before his hand closed on her throat. And a dog. Argos, bred and trained by Odysseus as a puppy 20 years before and left behind when he sailed. Now old and dying on a rubbish heap by the courtyard gate, too weak to stand, covered in ticks, neglected by everyone, and through the rags and the wrinkles and the 20 years and a disguise woven by a goddess that fooled every human being in that palace, the old dog knew his master. He had no strength to come closer. He dropped his ears and he wagged his tail. And Odysseus could not react. One gesture toward that animal and the disguise, the plan, and the lives of his wife and son were all at risk. So he turned his face away and flicked away a tear where the swineherd could not see it, and asked in a stranger's casual voice whose dog that was lying there, and had he been any good in his day. "Fine dog once," the swineherd said, "fastest thing in the woods, before his master sailed away and died." And they walked on into the courtyard, master and dog, pretending, for the sake of the mission, not to know each other. And Argos, says Homer, having seen Odysseus again in the 20th year, closed his eyes and died. Of all the deaths in this enormous poem, the warriors and the kings and the 600 men, it is the dog on the rubbish heap that readers have never gotten over. He asked for nothing. He waited without being asked to. And he held on, it seems, for exactly one thing. 20 years of an epic's entire meaning compressed into one wag of a dying tale. The rest you may know. The contest of the great bow that no suitor could string, and the ragged old beggar who strung it in one motion, the way a singer stretches a new string around a peg, and sent an arrow through the sockets of 12 axes without rising from his stool. And then the doors were locked, and the walls were bare of weapons, and 108 men looked up from their tables and understood at last whose house they had been eating in. And after the reckoning, after the hall was washed and fumigated, there was a woman sitting across the firelight from a man everyone swore was her husband, refusing to believe it, because she had spent 20 years holding off liars and was not going to fail the final exam out of longing. So she set her trap as casually as he had ever set one. She told the nurse to move his bed out of the bridal chamber and make it up for the stranger. And he detonated. "What man has moved my bed? I built that bed myself, around a living olive tree still rooted in the courtyard. I trimmed the trunk and made it the bedpost and built the room around it. No power short of a god could shift it without cutting the tree through." That was the password. And only the true man could have spoken it, and only by being provoked past his cunning into honest outrage. Which was, of course, the design. Her knees went loose where she sat, and Homer reaches for his final image and gives the homecoming what it has earned, as welcome as dry land is to swimmers whose ship the sea has wrecked, and who strike out from the grey water toward the shore, so welcome was her husband to her, and she could not let her arms go from his neck. He has spent an entire epic wrecking this man at sea, and in the last embrace he makes Penelope the shore. Athena held back the dawn that night, keeping the darkness in place a while longer so the two of them could talk. And they told each other 20 years, her weaving and her siege, and his whole long catalogue of wandering. And Homer notes that he told her everything. And this time, we believe him. That is the story. It has been the story for nearly 3,000 years, the template underneath half the tales our species tells. Every long way home, every clever underdog, every faithful wait. His name became a common noun in 100 languages, an Odyssey. Any long, difficult journey towards something that matters, and the heart of it has stayed exactly where the poet left it. In a man on a beach refusing eternity because it was not home. In a woman unpicking a shroud by lamplight. In a dog's tail moving on a rubbish heap. And in a bed built around a living tree, still rooted after everything. Now, gently, let it be over for you as well. There is no more sea to cross tonight. The hall is quiet, the fires are banked, and every ship is home. If tonight's voyage carried you somewhere good, you can like the video and subscribe, or leave a thought in the comments and I will read it in the morning. But that is tomorrow's business. For now, let your body sink a little heavier into the bed. Unclench your jaw. Let your breathing slow down all on its own. Close your eyes and let the sound of the water fade. Sleep is a kind of homecoming too. And yours is right here. Good night, guys, sweet dreams.